Welcome everyone. Today is another Wizards of Ox live session with our 4 wizards. We have Susan Owens, who is the group owner for the Triangle Oxalates group. We have Carla Wiersma, who is another of our senior admin team. We have Patricia de la Garza, who is joining us from Europe this fine evening for her. And I'm Monique Attinger. We are all the senior admin people on the Triangle Oxalates groups, both on Facebook and Groups.io. And we're here today to talk urban legends. Now, before we get started, I'd like everybody to remember this information is for educational purposes only. Please consult with your doctor if you have any questions about your unique health situation and any of the information that we're presenting here. And if you have any questions, we will be able to address some of those potentially at the end of the meeting. You can drop them in the chat. Okay, now as we get started, I am going to turn off other people's videos so that you don't accidentally end up on screen when we are doing our final video cut for the YouTube channel. So nice to see you, Julie. We're just going to stop your video for now. And let's get started. I will be happy to turn over to, I think you're starting, Susan.
Oh, well, yes, but we're going to show the whole list of things that we're going to go through.
Perfect. Yes.
So now this year, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to have some visual supports for those of you that are visual learners. And I think this is probably going to help with finding the information within each of the Wizards of Ox Live recordings. And it's also going to give you something that will be kind of like a mental reminder of the most important points in lowering your oxalate. And lowering your oxalate, we're going to be talking about different types of oxalate, and we're going to talk about, all sorts of common pitfalls. So we're just going to go one by one, and I guess each of the wizards is going to have like its own take, but the first one is a good one. So the first one of the urban legends that we have been seeing in many other pages and some articles and some podcasts and things like that, because now we've been at this for a long, long time, but now it's in the fashion and now everybody's talking about it and everybody's trying to grab some content, to fill their things. And we're seeing some things that are not necessarily 100% correct, and we want you to be aware of them so that you get the most up-to-date information, and also you avoid, those mistakes, those pits where we all have fallen, so that your journey can be a lot smoother. So first common pitfall is diet will solve all oxalate issues. Okay, and here, why are we talking about an urban legend? I guess we all have our own little stories, but the most important is that we are talking about 2 different sources of oxalate. We have the endogenous oxalate, which is the oxalate that our metabolism makes. Our body makes it inside our cells. And then we have what we could call the exogenous or the outside oxalate, which is the one that is comprised in the diet. So the one that we eat. And Susan, do you want to go at it with the first point?
I certainly do. Let me see if I can share my screen and get somewhere here.
Let me just stop mine. So, yeah.
Okay, Dylan. Okay, so where do scientists find that oxalate comes from? This is from a study by Hoppe et al. And they were looking at all the ways that we get oxalate into what we call our oxalate pool, which is all the oxalate that comes from all over places and ends up in our bodies. So they were studying primary hyperoxaluria, which is a genetic disorder. And that is, it's in your genes. And then there's secondary hyperoxaluria, which is where the rest of us fall. So the
Yeah.
first people involves about a few people per million people. So if you get a test and somebody says, oh, you have primary hyperoxaluria, just know that unless it runs in your family, you probably don't have primary hyperoxaluria. And I mean, I've heard all people say, oh, I went to this genetic site and they said I had primary hyperoxaluria. And I said, well, why did they tell you that? And they said, oh, well, I did this genetic test and they came up with these genes. And I said, well, give me the SNPs. And I look up the SNPs and none of the SNPs has anything to do with primary hyperoxaluria. It may be the same gene, but it isn't something that actually causes a defect that would cause you to make excess oxalate. And so this is really tricky. So don't think that if it doesn't run in your, if you don't have evidence that it runs in your family, that you have this issue. So secondary hyperoxaluria is where most of us are. And so with that, we can get it from diet. In this particular study, they were saying increased dietary intake of over 200 milligrams per day. Now, when I ran a survey on our group of people who had autoimmune disease, I was shocked that 85% of the people were over 300 milligrams a day. So that's definitely, qualifying as secondary hyperoxaluria. So for that reason, know that the diets have shifted, because in the old days, they used to say a normal American diet would be about 100 to 150 milligrams a day. And now it's way over that. So yes, we do have more possibilities that people are eating excess oxalate. But that doesn't mean that that's your only source of oxalate. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. So with dietary oxalate, you can have increased absorption that can come from your intestines. You can have problems degrading the oxalate in your intestines, and you can end up with less fecal excretion. So that's more the dietary angle. And another source is vitamin C, and we'll be talking about this in one of our other urban legends. But oxalate, vitamin C does turn into oxalate in pretty astonishing amounts, actually, and that adds to our oxalate pool. But what else adds to it? Well, endogenous oxalate will add to that, and you see that mainly in B6 deficiency or in people that have thiamine issues. And I'm going to explain to you how that works a little bit better. Now, this is a chart from Stackpool et al. And you can see here in the very center of this diagram is a substance called glyoxylate. And there I've circled it. Now, glyoxylate can be degraded in your body through two thiamine-dependent steps. So if you're low in thiamine, then you're not going to degrade it properly, and it's going to build up. And what happens when it builds up? You end up with oxalate. So that's the problem. That is an endogenous oxalate problem. Also, this is a B6 dependent step, this conversion of glyoxylate to glycolic acid. Now, glyoxylate is not on the standard organic acid test. It is in some countries, but most people are using the Great Plains oat, and that does not have glyoxylate on it. What it does have on there is glycolic acid. And so that's really how I monitor what's going on with your endogenous oxalate. And so scientists studied this issue in rats about B6 converting into oxalate. And so this is a study where they made the rats B6 and then they gave it glyoxylate, which converts into oxalate. And this was the diagram that they came up with. And you can see that the controls were way down here, but the vitamin B6 free diet made it go way up and even higher if you exposed it to the rats to glyoxylate. And so this is a big deal. I can't, let's see, I'm gonna have to move all this stuff down. Sorry, I can't see things. But this glycolic acid you can see here that in the controls it wasn't very high. If you were B6 deficient, it went higher. But if you I'm sorry, let's see what our the B6 free diet with glyoxylate, that's because more of it was converting into oxalate. So that's why the glycolic acid wasn't as high. Does that make sense? I hope so. Let's see. So here the oxalate became more than 3 times higher. So what happened is endogenous oxalate increased 3-fold. Well, this is something that gets really, really tricky because what it caused to happen was urinary creatinine went way up. You see how far it went up? And the problem with that is that everything on the oat is ratioed to creatinine, which means, you know, if you make a ratio like 1 to 2 is just 0.5, 1 to 8 is 0.125, and 0.5 is a whole lot bigger than 0.125. So what happens is everything on the oat looks low, including oxalate, including anything that's on that test. So a lot of people will look at the test and a lot of doctors will say, oh my gosh, you don't have an oxalate problem, all your numbers are low. But they don't realize that when your oxalate goes up, it's going to make all the other numbers go lower. And so this is a big issue and not recognizing what's going on. So this says 4 times higher when they made these rats B6 deficient. So that can happen in you. So that would make all the values on an oat look 4 times lower and possibly even look normal. Okay, so this is new data that I have. These are people that I've seen in, you know, the last 2 or 3 years. And those are the gray bars. And this is the glycolic acid. But this is what I used to see. Okay. Now I am definitely looking at the people who the diet didn't work. That wasn't their whole source of oxalate. So the people who come to me for consults are the people mainly who have this endogenous oxalate. And so they find themselves in the second curve. Does that make sense? It does.
Yes.
Okay. My ladies are shaking their heads. So I hope so. So people in the second curve may be primarily endogenous producers. Okay, this is the next item, but somebody else introduced that for me.
I will do that. So let me just go. So just to shorten that up, so diet will not solve all oxalate issues if you are one of those rare cases of, you know, primary hyperoxaluria, which is a genetic illness. And but it would be very rare, or if you are producing it because you have some vitamin deficiencies, either caused by stress, antibiotics, antifungals, or something else, something that's causing a stress into that system is going to make your metabolism, instead of going to this direction, going to that direction. And that direction turns into an oxalate producing cell or factory, so to speak. So that's the first common pitfall that we're going to be talking about. The second one, we're going to be talking about the goodness of mega dosing of vitamin C. So we're talking here about our IV cocktails. We're talking about taking vitamin C to bowel
Tolerance, bowel
tolerance. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Tolerance, to bowel tolerance. And I don't know if Carla of Monique wants to make a little points before Susan goes into the whole explanation.
I would like to make one point on the endogenous versus exogenous oxalate.
Yeah. Mhm.
Even if you are having issues with endogenous production, it's not necessarily a good idea to throw the diet out the window.
Oh,
That's a
no.
good point.
Because
That's a good point.
in
That's a
that
very
case-
good point.
Yeah, because in that case, what you're doing is adding fuel to the fire. So it's probably, I would say it's very recommended if you're lowering your oxalate, you still find that your numbers are high, you're still having problems, you discover you're an endogenous producer, keep lowering that oxalate, because all that's doing is helping you reduce the load. I mean, the primary focus is on getting that endogenous oxalate under control, but you don't really need to add fuel to the fire by, diet's not really doing any good. Well, yeah, it kind of is. Even
It's
if it's
still
not the primary
reducing.
problem.
Yeah, it's still reducing that overall pool, like Susan was discussing.
Right. And I want to emphasize that, if you do the diet and you're saying, oh, well, this really didn't help me, so that means I don't have an oxalate problem. That's not really necessarily true, because you may be making so much endogenous oxalate that it doesn't really change that much. Now, I will give myself as an example, because I got into this because I was doing autism research and I found oxalate elevated in autism. And so I went to my first oxalate conference, and there was a speaker there that talked about how oxalate binds and exacerbates injuries in tissues. And so I had an injured foot for 2 years. The injury wasn't that bad, but oh my gosh, it was like fire every time I would get out of the bed in the morning. And so I thought, oh, do I have an oxalate problem? And so I went home and I got on the low oxalate diet. And sure enough, in about 3 weeks, that injury healed and it wasn't a problem anymore. But I still had an oxalate problem. And I came to realize that later as I addressed the endogenous oxalate. So I didn't dump. A lot of people talk about dumping in that experience, but while I was on the diet, I didn't dump. But after I started increasing my the vitamins that you need to get rid of endogenous oxalate, that's when I had my glorious dumps. So just realize that it is an issue of you have 2 different sources, and what the most important thing for you to do for yourself is to figure out what is the split between the dietary oxalate and the endogenous oxalate, but always keeping in mind that they add together to produce that perfect storm.
Absolutely. That's a great explanation.
Yeah.
I don't think most people are going to find that, because of how common it is to be under antibiotics. I mean, even if you haven't taken them, a lot of the non-organic food has antibiotics in it. So your microbiome is not going to be in the perfect state, and your body is going to start trying to adapt to all those situations. And it's going to end up having, to use your stores of things like B6 and such. So I think it's always a good idea to relate that we're talking about 2 possibly very important sources for most people. And on the vitamin C, anybody?
Yeah,
Yes,
on
I
the
was.
vitamin C, I was one of those people who was doing vitamin C as part of I think they call it a Myers cocktail.
Yes.
And once I'd learned about oxalate, I took a break from doing these IV treatments, and I was working on the diet and I was working on my supplements. But one of the things they had available was that you could get an IV infusion of things like minerals and so on. So I went back to this clinic because I'd been working with them for a while. And I said, I would like to still get an infusion, but I would like to get the minerals and maybe some B6 because I was tolerating B6 okay. And I thought this would be really helpful. And they ignored me and added the vitamin C anyway. And when I found out afterwards, I was a bit concerned about what was going to happen, but I thought, well, I've been taking these all the way along. I'll be fine. And then I had 6 weeks of agony as my body dealt with 5,000 milligrams of oxalate or whatever it was after I got 5,000 milligrams of vitamin C. And, the likelihood that a good percentage of that went to oxalate is something we could expect, particularly based on the research. So Susan's going to talk more about the research, but I just wanted to say, if you are taking really high levels of vitamin C and you also aren't seeing results, it could be that vitamin C is keeping a very large pool of oxalate available in your body. And we do know that vitamin C degrades naturally into oxalate. This is not something fancy that our body does. This is just the normal degradation pathway. And so it's not like anybody gets a get out of jail free card on this one.
Absolutely.
Well, I did want to point out that this is a very slow process. It's not something that happens overnight. And so there was a lot of old research that was saying, oh, well, not very much converts into oxalate. But number one, they were just, they weren't accounting for other sources of oxalate or other sources of vitamin C. And so it was very imprecise. And they were maybe measuring it for a day, and then they just thought what you made a day later was representing the whole conversion. And so there was later research showing that the half-life, like the half-time of the conversion of ascorbic acid into oxalate was 15 days.
Yeah, which is probably why I was dealing with it for weeks, because
yes,
then it turned into oxalate, and then I had to get rid of the oxalate, and ergo that would have taken a lot of time. Right.
And the quick conversion is pretty, huge. I had this one child who got 2 oats on the same day, and I was asking the mom, why did you get 2 oats on the same day? And she said, oh, well, it's because he got a Myers cocktail. And his oxalate went up 44-fold just in that 10 hours or something like that. So it can be very significant. And, I let my doctor talk me into a vitamin C IV, a Myers cocktail, I'm sure it was. And for the next 24 hours, I had blood clots all over the place. Now, that probably has more to do with something unique to me. I'm not saying that's going to happen to everybody, but that was a risk factor that I had that I didn't realize that, my body was going to go nuts over this extended conversion to oxalate because it couldn't tolerate that much oxalate. And so I just want you to, pay attention to what your body's doing. And if you use a treatment like vitamin C and you see, things going on that you don't understand and you're trying to figure out what happened to me, then realize that it could be that the oxalate itself that's converting from the vitamin C may be causing issues. Now, one thing that's important to understand is this is very individual. So this is a study that they were looking at 3 different people, number 1, number 2, number 3.
Ron, let me stop sharing this so that you can share yours. And the other thing is that it's really important what she's doing the presentation is that all forms of vitamin C are going to go through the same degradation. That's probably one of the most often asked questions within the group. Is like, oh, but I have this special form of vitamin C. Fill in the blank, whatever it is.
Calcium ascorbate, magnesium ascorbate, any of these mineral
Ascorbic acid
chelate.
is going to convert. So
Yeah.
whatever form this vitamin C is coming, it will convert in this manner. So
This is the reaction of ascorbic acid turning into oxalate. And you can see that there's several steps. And this is after you use ascorbic acid as an antioxidant, it converts into dihydroascorbic acid. And then there's one more step in between before it converts into oxalate. Now, the deal is like what Patricia was saying, any form of vitamin C, no matter what form it is, it's not going to work as vitamin C until it's already converted it into ascorbic acid. So you don't have to worry about an oxalate issue related to which form you take, because it doesn't matter. Because if it's going to act as vitamin C, it's already formed ascorbic acid and formed the oxalate. And so that's really important. And so after your oral ingestion of labeled ascorbic acid, now that's when somebody has taken ascorbic acid and changed one of the carbons on it so that it weighs different. You know, it's identified in a different way. And so what they do is they watch that label and see what it comes out as. And some of it will come out as ascorbic acid because you pee it right off out. And then some of it turns into oxalate. So this is showing the conversion into oxalate. And this is showing how many days out. And what's interesting about this is you can see it sort of forms a straight line. And then you have one day that you have this huge amount and another day where you have a teeny tiny amount. And so this is why it is not a straight line, and why when people measure it, they don't really get how long a process it is, so that you have to worry about it for weeks and weeks about that conversion. Okay, and so that's about what I had on that.
okay. And now another thing that is really important on the mega dosing of vitamin C is that in order for it to be used as an antioxidant and be able to recycle and do kind of like the whole cycle that everybody needs done, you are actually going to need a lot of cofactors. So just taking vitamin C is not enough. If you want ever to use vitamin C, you're going to need CoQ10, vitamin E, alpha lipoic acid, and glutathione to work in the correct proportions in order for this vitamin C to recycle. And it's going to be, and anyway, at the end, it's still going to turn into oxalate. So you're just going to have to be very, very careful with that vitamin C. It's not as innocuous, or is not as simple a thing that, you know, it's the winter and I'm just going to up my vitamin C by a gram or two. It has consequences, and you should be aware of it. The maximum recommended for this group, we're saying that it's about 250 milligrams for an adult, for like a 60 kilogram person, which is like an average adult. So that's what we are recommended. And
let me throw out one other thing, because some of us are dealing with children. And so, you know, children are very different ages, and what they need as far as vitamin C is concerned is different depending on how much they weigh. And so really what we're looking at is 4 times the RDA for whatever age somebody is. Okay, so if you're really little, if you're 2 years old, that's different from when you're 13 years old.
that's really good. Okay, so now another one of the big questions that often comes up that we decided it was also a little bit of an urban legend that we needed to discuss is the fact that Candida makes oxalate. And a lot of people are concerned of have reported in the group that they have issues with different types of mold that's making them sick, that's having all these different reactions. So to have a better understanding, you should know that some microorganisms make oxalates in large amounts. They do. You know, something like a fridge mold, I'm sorry, I just blanked out.
Thinking aspergillus.
Thank you. Aspergillus. Yeah. So that one is one of those microorganisms that does make oxalate in large amounts. But in order for you to get an aspergillosis, you also have to have like a weakened immune system. So we have to be taking everything like that. But what's really important is that Candida is not one of those microorganisms that just spews out oxalates in large amounts. It is not. So Susan is laughing. Candida doesn't like oxalate. And when it's in the presence of oxalate, that it actually converts into like its mean cousin, into its pathogenic state to protect from this oxalate that's around it. So it's actually irritating for her. So as a natural consequence, you have to be very wary of anything that's killing all that microbiome, because it often does more harm than good.
Okay, so I will slip in here again. Okay, if you study about fatal cases of Candida in humans, there is no mention of oxalate at all. Now, you know that if something's killing you, they would be mentioning it if it was a big deal. And so I looked today, and out of 860 articles in PubMed about fatal candidiasis, the mention of oxalate does not even appear once in the abstracts. Do you get that? It really means it is an urban legend, because we don't know, we don't have science that is exact enough to get rid of the possibility of other sources of oxalate. And we also know that oxalate drives, as Patricia was saying, it drives Candida crazy. It doesn't like it. It tries to do all sorts of things to cope with that. And so here's a picture of it. Whoops, I wanted to do that. What happened? I'm sorry. Okay. When you look at Candida, it has this traveling relationship with human beings, because one of the things is mutualism, which means I scratch your back, you scratch mine. We like each other, we get along, I do certain things for you and you do certain things for me. And that is where it is most of the time. And it's a very normal thing to be in the human body. Please don't think it is just a pathogen, because it has this existence with human beings that has been there forever. And then you have a tolerance here, and then we have what's commensalism, which is we're sort of like, you know, we're okay with each other kind of thing. But then some things change in the body, and it converts into an inflammatory situation, and that's when it gets ugly. And when it starts making these little hyphae that puncture cell membranes and that sort of thing. And so Exposure to oxalate was found to shift Candida into its pathogenic state, where it puts out mycelia and punches holes in cell membranes using a factor it has called Candida lysin. So you see how it's puncturing holes and then it's putting out all this Candida lysin. That's what causes all the terrible symptoms and all, you know. But in its normal yeast state, Candida doesn't cause any symptoms at all. And so it is not appropriate to think of Candida as always an enemy. You know, there may be some awful bad guy in your community. And if the bad guy is not doing something bad, then he's not a threat to you. He's only a threat to you when he's doing something bad. So in the same sense, you should think that Candida you know, is not a problem until it gets really upset about life and in your body. And so the two treatments against Candida also damage our cell membranes, punching holes in them and in the cell membrane that the inflammasome, which is part of the immune system, recognizes as dangerous. And that further turns on inflammation. So even nystatin, like oxalate, can be recognized by the immune system as a problem, and it can turn on chronic inflammation, which then can be associated with all these other things on the list. And these, as you see in this chart, microbes can activate the inflammasome. So Candida can, but also nystatin can. So it's really important to understand that you've got to understand what's happening in your body. And so you know, that takes more careful diagnostics, but just be aware that it's not all that Candida is. There's no evidence that anybody has found that Candida is making oxalate directly. There's people that have advanced that as an hypothesis, but it's not an hypothesis that has been proven. Does that make sense?
Well,
Yep.
Susan, if somebody had already the angry Candida, how would you treat that?
Well, one of the big things is if you're high oxalate, it's going to stay angry. So reducing your oxalate may make it go away. And I think we've had a lot of list mates who had a bad Candida problem. And then they reduced oxalate and it stopped being an issue and they stopped needing treatment for it. So, you know, that's pretty important. Now, if you have to do something to make yourself feel better, you know, like if you have a urinary, I mean, if you're a woman and you have a yeast infection down under there, you might want to use some treatment that's topical or something like that to make yourself feel better. And I'm not saying that that is a no-no, but if you're taking a more all over your body treatment, you may find that it causes as much problems as the Candida itself. And that's where we have a problem, is that the treatments are problems themselves.
Okay.
When it comes to systemic Candida, I had some troubles with it. And I remember trying high dose biotin because you had spoken about biotin.
Oh, yes.
Susan.
And how did that work for you?
For me, it was wonderful. I did need to get up to a fairly high dose. I did stay there for, I think, about a month, but then I was able to come down and off that high dose. And now I take kind of a maintenance dose, but I've never had ever since doing that sort of regimen for a little bit. I've never had a problem with Candida systemically since.
Well, one of the issues that this brings up is that the microbes that live in our gut are a lot like us. In fact, they need kind of the same things. And I've seen a lot of people making a big deal about, well, Candida needs biotin, and other microbes need vitamin C and B6 and thiamine and whatnot. And so there's some people who have this idea that the way to get rid of microbes in overgrowth is to starve yourself, because they're saying, oh, well, you're starving the microbes. But when you starve the microbes, you're also starving yourself. And so it's very important for the host to stay healthy. So you don't want to do any treatment that makes you worse. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so just understand that there's a lot of parallels between what our microbes are looking for and what we're looking for. And if our bodies are deficient in a nutrient, then our microbes are also deficient in the nutrient, and they're scrambling around trying to figure out, how do I get this? Now, the difference is some of them can make it. And they found now that a lot of the microbes are sort of living in community. And if one microbe is lacking a nutrient, another microbe will start expanding its population, trying to meet that need. And so this is the difference in how the science is going in this area, is now we're understanding more about this mutualism, about how we all kind of live in this community together. And that's just a very different point of view from what we had years ago, when, it was, you have to be survival of the fittest, and, you have to kill everything that's underneath you. And that hasn't worked very well for human beings. If you think of people like Stalin and Lenin and Pol Pot and all of these people who thought that killing was the way to, gain ascendancy, it didn't work very well.
Well, even in things like farming, where we've thought that we needed to kill pests, and then it turns out there are unforeseen side effects and impacts. So yeah, we can look at almost any area, but certainly other areas that are environments on our planet. And we can say, when you take this approach where it's more about killing than it is about supporting the environment, you don't necessarily get the results that you're looking for.
Well, and broad spectrum is still indiscriminate, and nothing works in a vacuum.
Well, we don't have enough research. I mean, there's this one study that I've loved that was done on beta-lactam antibiotics, and it was looking on how it shifts the microbiome. And one of the things that was just astonishing that in that study is that they showed that the big shift happened 40 days later. Well, when you take an antibiotic, you're not thinking about what happens 40 days later. You're thinking, oh, all the effect is right away. And so there's just a lot of it that we're learning from our scientists, and they're doing a fabulous job of kind of undoing some of the myths that we have. And that's, of course, what we're talking about today is urban myths. So that's one of them, is that antibiotics are the solution to any kind of imbalance. Because when else in life is that true? That the way you get balance is by killing your enemies or killing your friends or killing anybody. It just doesn't seem to work that way.
Absolutely. Well, let's go on, because we have a few minutes and we have still 3 points to go. But so another point, another urban legend that we wanted to talk about, because it comes also up, not so much the group, because I think people that have been in the group for a long time have seen that oxalate is affecting so many different body systems and so many different diagnoses, and so many people from different ages and sexes and national origins and whatnot. But if you look at the literature often, or if you talk even to doctors and you say, I have an oxalate problem, they're going to say, oh, oxalate only affects the kidney. And that, in fact, is an urban legend. It can be stored in all tissues. Cells all over the body can produce it. And once it's in your blood, it can go anywhere.
Anywhere it can be trafficked. And so the challenge here is that we're starting to see some research where it's talking about oxalate and things like arthritis or oxalate, and in particular breast cancer as well. So other kinds of inflammatory conditions where oxalate is a player, but that does not seem to have necessarily made it out into the hands of your family physician. So they may still only believe that oxalate's a problem if you have kidney stones. But even the research itself is starting to show that we're recognizing it in other places.
Well, there's a lot of research on calcifications all over the body.
Yeah.
And if you look into them, you find out that nobody asked what they were. They made assumptions that they were maybe calcium phosphate or something else like that. And so actually, usually oxalate will attach to a calcium phosphate before it builds up, kind of like a pearl builds up, on a little piece of sand. It kind of works the same place way in other parts of your body. And so now that we understand that oxalate goes all over the body, we should be having our scientists looking at calcifications all over the body, not just in the kidney.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yes. We'll move on to point number 5, unless somebody else wants to say something, Carla?
I'm good.
Okay. So this one goes to back to the diet and the cooking and whatever. And another thing that we hear over and over and over again is that I don't have to remove my fill in the blank almonds, spinach, or whatever, because I am soaking it or cooking it in a certain way, and that takes care of the oxalate. And so here we're just going to very briefly talk about it. We've talked about it in other recordings of the Wizards of Ox Life. But to make it very simple, you have to remember that there's 2 types of oxalate. You have the soluble and you have the insoluble. Soluble, it goes away in the liquid. And if you don't use that liquid for a soup or for something else and you throw it away, then it's gone. Part of it. So, you have to remember only what's on the surface that can get in contact with the water and whatnot. The insoluble one is going to stay. And I think Carla has some examples.
Yep. Well, and like you said, not all of the soluble oxalate is going to be leached out. And that's one thing that we found through testing. Let me see here. I'm going to have to share screen here in a second. Hang on. So here we've got a couple of examples.
just a sec. I don't think we're seeing you.
Okay.
Try again.
Try your screen share.
Let's see, I did hit share screen. You got it?
No.
Nope, not sure what's happening. Oh,
Oh,
there we go.
There we go. Okay, so we have here just a couple of examples. We have the wild rice that was just cooked, basically boiled for 20 minutes, and where you've cooked it pretty much per package directions. So
Can
you're
you
not throwing out
expand?
any of the water.
Sorry, can you expand a little bit so it's just the one slide and give us like a bigger, there we go. just so people can see it.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
So we've got the wild rice that's been cooked, essentially boiled for 20 minutes, which is traditionally how you're going to cook the rice anyway. You're not throwing the water out. And so I can see it here. You can see that your oxalate per serving and then the amount of soluble oxalate that's there. The after is you've soaked it for 12 hours. You've cooked it, soaked, rinsed, tossed out that water. And you see you've definitely reduced your overall oxalate and soluble oxalate, but it's, you've went from 100% soluble to now you still have 45% of that being soluble. So it hasn't, the soaking and getting rid of the water and boiling it hasn't really gotten rid of it. It's gotten rid of a lot of it, but not all of it. The second we used was millet. And again, you can see that you have your oxalate per serving is 6. A good portion of that is soluble oxalate. 91% of it is. You've soaked it, drained, rinsed, and boiled. And you can see where it's went from medium oxalate to low oxalate, and that you have a smaller amount of soluble oxalate, but again, it hasn't eliminated all of that soluble oxalate. A certain portion is still there, and we haven't seen with testing that it's eliminated all of that oxalate. It's still, again, it's still there, just in a more manageable form.
What about spinach, Carla?
Spinach has, it does have some soluble oxalate, but not a lot. And even if you got rid of all of the soluble oxalate, it would still be pretty high.
Right. And
So-
so that we do have to worry about that, and that, we can't just make assumptions that everything is going to float out into the water and get thrown out just because you want it to.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem to work that way.
Well, and I think the other aspect of this is that people assume that if it's insoluble, you're automatically protected from it. But with things like leaky gut, and with also things like, potentially that oxalate occurring in a food in a microcrystal kind of form, we could be driving that inflammation of the gut. And so I do think there are people out there who are saying if it's insoluble, it's a get out of jail free card. And I don't think we can assume that yet either. Because if the gut's being irritated by these microcrystals, like I always visualize kind of even the finest sandpaper grain. Now that might not hurt you with a little bit of a rub, but if it's constantly going over your skin, even a really fine sandpaper is going to start to irritate. And so if we're eating something that's got a high percentage of insoluble in it, and I think spinach actually has like a fairly good percentage of the oxalate that's there is insoluble, but it's a very high amount. And so if we're doing something like eating that every day, just to, imagine sandpaper going through that gut over and over and over again. It's really, we've always advocated on the group to count all the oxalate that's in there. And I think that's really a good position unless we see research that tells us otherwise.
Well, and the other thing to think about is like with nuts. Nuts also have a high fat content. And And that may be one of the reasons that we see that when we soak it, we're not removing a lot of oxalate, and it could be due to the high fat content of a
Another
lot
great
of those
point.
nuts. Yeah, because I mean, when we tested walnuts, we didn't test almonds, but we tested walnuts and pecans, and it lowered it, but you know, it went from kind of high medium to or you know, very high at the medium range to very high at the lower range. It maybe dropped 3 or 4, you know, 3 or 4 points. So it went from 26 to 21. You know, every little bit helps, but you know, and that was soaking for 12 hours, boiling, and then dehydrating.
Yeah, it just
And
didn't get us as much bang for the buck as any of us would have hoped when that
Yeah.
experiment was done. Yeah.
And you know, I just want to throw this out because I mean, it's kind of a stupid observation, but it's something that we don't think about that much. The main way to reduce oxalate is to eat less of a high oxalate food. So if you want to half your oxalate content and you don't want to soak something all night or whatever, just don't eat as much and eat more of the low oxalate food compared to the high oxalate food. And that
Yeah.
can get you far.
Yeah, the condiment size portion, as we talk about sometimes at this house, where, you know, my family really likes things like walnuts and pecans as well. And what we'll do is take, you know, 1 or 2 halves, chop that up and have it over something like ice cream or something where I know the base is low, or maybe sprinkle a little bit over the top of, you know, like apple pie where it's got some whipped cream on it to kind of hold the nuts. So that, you know, you have a little bit, but a tiny little bit, and it gives you some taste and it gives you some texture, but you're not losing your mind on a whole handful of something. Anyhow, we have one more, Patricia.
Yes. And you cannot, that's another question that comes up over and over and over in the group. And I think this might be just a good way so that everybody can start, you know, being very knowledgeable about this thing. And it's the fact that you cannot take vitamin D with LOD, with the low oxalate diet. We've heard that a lot. Oh, but I'm doing low oxalate, so I'm taking calcium, but I can't take down vitamin D. And here it's all a question of timing. Who wants to take this?
Oh,
Me?
I'd be happy to
I can
take
take it. I can take it, but okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, we can both take it. I mean, what I say to people too is that a lot of these things are not all or nothing. If you sit down and eat, I'm going to pull something out of a hat, like a fatty fish that has the bones in, but may have some vitamin D present, right? It doesn't mean that somehow because you're having the bones that have calcium and the vitamin D at the same time that something terrible is going to happen. I would argue that if you're getting something that's got vitamin D and calcium at the same time, it may promote you being able to absorb the calcium, but especially with supplements, we don't usually absorb 100% of a supplement. So it really depends what you're taking something like calcium for. So if you're taking calcium for absorption, then you might want to take it with vitamin D, and you might want to take it away from meals so you're not creating yourself some confusion with the meal. If you're taking calcium with a meal to bind oxalate in the gut, note that oxalate in the gut's not the same as oxalate in your body. From your body standpoint, the gut's kind of still outside. It's in your body once it goes from the gut into what they call the lumen or your bloodstream. Like it's got to move out of the gut for it to be absorbed. So when we're taking calcium to bind oxalate, we're trying not to promote absorption. That's the reason you want to take your vitamin D separately, because vitamin D helps to promote the absorption of the calcium. So we say plain calcium or calcium magnesium. Magnesium works as well. We take this preferably before the meal, so that those minerals, whatever capsule or tablet or whatever that you've taken, is in the gut and available when the food gets there. And then what you're hoping to do is have a free oxalate bind with a free calcium or magnesium, and then those dance partners stay bound together until they leave with the stool. Not a get out of jail free card, because this is essentially insoluble oxalate. And we were just talking about how we really need to count the oxalate that's in our food, but it may prevent you from absorbing some of it out of the gut and into the lumen, just not the get out of jail free. And because we do need vitamin D, great way to get it is just go outside, expose a little bit of your skin. Don't do it for too long. We don't want anybody to burn, but your body will make vitamin D. Then it's separate from the gut. You don't have to worry that you're taking a supplement where there's vitamin D in with your minerals. But ideally for binding, we want the minerals to stay in the gut. We want them to meet up with their free oxalate, and then we want them to leave bound together with the stool.
And
I would like to,
go ahead,
to
go ahead.
I would like to say that, we got this idea that vitamin D equals absorbing calcium and getting it in your bones. I mean, that's what we all kind of grew up thinking. But, the main function of vitamin D is really in the immune system, and it's a huge regulator of all sorts of things. And so this is why we don't want to just think it's all related to calcium, because it's not. A lot of people during COVID were told to take really high doses of vitamin D, and that was because it's so important to the immune system. So if you live someplace, far away from the equator where you don't get very much sun, okay, then you are going to be at a disadvantage during the season when you don't get so much sun, okay? And so you're the one that needs to be worried about, well, maybe I need to be supplementing it. Maybe what I'm getting from going outside and sitting in the sun is not so great. And so you have to be very cognizant of what is known in your country where you live, to try to assess your need for this. And so the only reason we put this on this list is that we want so much for you not to be scared of taking vitamin D, and just to do it intelligently. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Really, it's a matter of timing. I'm trying to think of that calcium. What do you want it to be used for? So that sandpaper that Monique was talking about, it's actually all that oxalate that it's outside of the body in the intestines, not yet absorbed. Then we want it to meet with something so that it can go out instead of being absorbed. And so what we do in our family, we just get like a little shot glass. We put the calcium citrate and the magnesium citrate, because we can do citrate at this time, and put a little bit of, like apple juice or whatever with it. And we drink it with a straw. And we do that before we start preparing the meal. So, it's probably about 20 to 30 minutes that we do it before, and then we're setting the table, we're warming up things, we're serving and whatever. And that gap is going to allow that calcium and that magnesium to get to the gut, so that when the oxalate starts getting there, the minerals are already there to link it and help it get out. So that's a little bit the idea. If you're taking calcium for your bones, for your immune system, or for, the vitamin D for your immune system, whatever, take it in a different moment. And that should take care of it. So I think that's just a very easy way to think about it.
Oh, and also just be aware that it is a fat soluble vitamin. So you cannot absorb a fat soluble vitamin without fat.
Actually, my favorite way by far of taking my vitamin D was with my ketogenic butter coffee in the morning.
Oh,
And then I just add my vitamin D to that. I put my coffee in the blender with a little bit of butter, and it is like a latte, and it's lovely. So there's lots of ways for us to get our vitamin D at an appropriate moment with some fat to make sure that we're absorbing it, and just away from our regular meal when we might want to be getting our calcium, not for purposes of absorption, but maybe we're getting it to start out with at the beginning of the meal so that it's going to help to bind to oxalate.
oh, and
Exactly.
I do also want to say that years ago, I read some articles that said about 80% of the calcium that we eat stays in the stool all the way to the exit. So see, we've been kind of brainwashed by all this dairy council stuff and all of that, that it's all about, you know, you have to get it in your bones and you have to absorb it and everything like that. But biologically, we weren't built that way. We were built more for it to be in the gut, to have a function in the gut all the way through.
And I'd also argue recent research that I've been following is talking about the importance of protein and bones. So bones are not all about calcium either. They're about a protein matrix that other minerals fit into. And so for those who are concerned about their bones, and you know, we have reason to take good care of our bodies, but just remember that calcium is not the only thing here either.
Absolutely. Okay. And with that, we're already 9 minutes past the hour. So we're going to be closing this Wizards of Ox Live. And we're going to be posting this little 6-point info sheet together with the recording of this YouTube transmission, I suppose.
Discussion video.
Yeah, special video. And we will also be having a ongoing file where we're going to be putting all of them together so that by the end of the year, hopefully we have, you know, probably about a 50 some number of these resumes for our Wizards of Ox Live. So without further ado, ladies, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to Julie and Paul and JH and all the others that joined us. And we will see you then next week with another Wizards of Ox Live.